Hi, I'm Eddie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer, and this is another episode in our series entitled There's a Form for That. And I'm joined once more by my friend, Camden Schutte.
Yeah, I'm Camden Schutte, designated broker for Coldwell Banker 360 team and 360 Property Management on Whidbey and Fidalgo Islands. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And we're talking today about Forms 40 and 40A as an apple.
Yep.
So, Camden, I'm writing an offer for my buyer, and the seller is offered to pay compensation through the MLS, and I want to take that compensation. So I'm going to fill out a Form 40 and attach to my buyer's offer, right?
No. Form 40 and 40A are simply instructions to escrow of what to do with your compensation. They're not part of the purchase and sale agreement.
Okay, he's right. So the Forms 40 and 40A, compensation disbursement form or escrow instructions is the lay term for those forms.
Yeah.
That's what most people would call them, is escrow instructions. And your firm may or may not use Forms 40 and 40A. Your firm may have its own forms that they use as escrow instructions, instructing escrow as to how they want the settlement statement completed with respect to the compensation that either seller or buyer are paying to the firms. So for example, let's say seller has offered to pay compensation to the listing firm and to the buyer broker's firm. Typically, the listing broker would start this process, and they would use which of those two forms?
Form 40.
Form 40 to instruct escrow to put money in the seller's column,
Yep.
right? Form 40 puts money or controls money in the seller's column. So if we filled out the Form 40, instructed escrow that we want seller to pay, X percent to the listing firm and Y percent to the buyer broker's firm, then escrow would use Form 40 and fill out the settlement statement, putting the corresponding dollar values into the seller's column.
Yep.
And with that, the firms would each get paid.
Right. So basically thinking about it differently, the 40 and 40A are the invoices from the firm to escrow saying what their compensation should be. Just like if you had a propane bill, it got sent to escrow saying, hey, we need to get paid this. That's basically what you're looking at here.
Great analogy. But in that case, it's not the actual propane bill, is
Right.
it?
No.
And with respect to compensation, if you're submitting escrow instructions to escrow, 40 or 40A, saying that the parties, either party, because if it's seller's column, it's going to be Form 40. If it's money going in buyer's column, typically buyer paying buyer broker's firm, you're going to use the 40A, correct? So if you're going to use either 40 or 40A, then in your transaction folder, you better have what?
You better have an agreement with that party of what that compensation is.
Right.
So maybe that's either your buyer broker agreement, your buyer agency agreement, or your listing agreement, or potentially a 41C if there's something happening with the offer of compensation that was negotiated in the purchase and sale agreement.
That's exactly. Once again, he's exactly right. So the listing agreement would identify, the listing agreement between seller and listing firm would identify the amount of compensation that seller is going to pay and how it's going to be dispersed between the two parties. And if the buyer accepts seller's offer of compensation, just like it's written, that's easy. You just need a Form 40, the escrow company will fill out the seller's side of the settlement statement corresponding to the listing agreement, you're done. But if it gets more complicated, maybe buyer is bringing money to the closing table. Maybe buyer offered to pay X percent and seller doesn't offer that much to buyer broker's firm. And buyer says, don't trouble the seller with the difference. I'm going to just bring it to closing.
Right.
That would be when you would use a 40A. That's one example,
Yep,
right?
Exactly. Because you have the agreement, the buyer agency agreement saying what the compensation to the buyer's agent is going to be, what the buyer's obligation is, and therefore you're giving escrow instructions of here's how much the buyer owes me. Maybe the seller's covering some of that in their offer of compensation, and the rest the buyer has to bring to the table.
And you use a 40A so that escrow can identify the amount the buyer is going to bring, so that when all the numbers run down to the bottom number, what the check is that buyer needs to bring to closing, it's going to include that amount going to the buyer broker's company.
Absolutely.
Right.
Or another scenario, if the buyer broker happens to want to credit back to the buyer a portion. And I've seen that tried to be done on a Form 34, which is an addendum to the purchase and sale agreement. And anything that's happening in that compensation between the buyer broker and the buyer isn't part of the purchase and sale agreement.
No.
So simply revising your agreement between those two parties, buyer agency agreement in that scenario, and then providing escrow
or maybe the
instructions.
buyer agency agreement said that in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And then providing those instructions to escrow.
And then providing those, right. So it might be that seller is offered X, buyer only owes buyer broker Y, which is less than X, then what Camden is saying is exactly right. You could use the Form 40A to instruct the escrow company as to how compensation should be distributed between buyer's column and the 40 for the seller's column.
That's
I think
right.
I just made it really confusing with that last statement, but
40 and 40A, some firms use their own, is the invoice to escrow. It's telling escrow what to do with your compensation, whether you're the buyer broker or the listing broker. And anything that's happening in that between you and your client isn't part of the purchase and sale agreement.
you better have it documented
That's
and in
right.
your firm's transaction folder,
Absolutely.
right? If you have questions on this, I'll try to figure out an answer for them. And if I don't succeed, I'll call Camden and ask him for help. But please visit warealtor.org, follow the links to the legal hotline, and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.